The wind on the Mongolian steppe in the year 1171 carried a specific kind of silence. It was the silence that follows abandonment. A 9-year-old boy crouched in a frozen ditch near the Anan River, his small fingers digging through hardened soil for roots and field mice. His father was dead, poisoned 3 days earlier at a Tatar feast. His clan had stripped his family of every horse, every sheep, and every weapon. They had ridden away across the white plain, leaving a widow and 7 children to die of starvation before the spring thaw. This boy eating rodents in a ditch will, within 35 years, command the largest army on the planet. He will unify 27 warring tribes into a single weaponized civilization. He will build a contiguous land empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea, larger than anything Rome ever achieved in 4 centuries of expansion. His grandchildren will rule from Korea to Hungary. 3 continents will learn to fear his name. His name at this moment is Temujin. The world will eventually call him Genghis Khan. Historical texts like The Secret History of the Mongols and the Chronicles of Rashid al-Din do not begin his story with sword skills or noble bloodlines. They begin with hunger. They begin with shame. They begin with a starving child who learned before his 10th birthday that the entire structure of nomadic society was built on a lie. Loyalty was not real. Bloodlines were not protection. Tradition was not a shield. Everything could be taken. Everything could be betrayed. How did an abandoned exile, eating marmots in violation of every taboo of his people, engineer the destruction of empires and become the most feared warlord in human history? Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we are exploring these ancient stories together, connected across centuries by our shared curiosity about the past. The poisoning of Yesugei the Brave is the foundational economic event in Mongol history. Temujin's father was not a king. He was a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a sub-branch of the broader Mongol confederation. He commanded perhaps 40 families. His power was measured in horses and in alliances, both of which evaporated the moment he stopped breathing. The Tatars had hosted Yesugei at a feast on his return journey from arranging Temujin's marriage. They recognized him as the man who had killed several of their own warriors years earlier. They smiled. They poured fermented mare's milk into his cup. They mixed something into it. He rode 3 days before the poison finished its work, collapsing in his own tent. What happened next reveals the true brutality of steppe economics. The Taichiad, a closely related clan that had ridden under Yesugei's banner, did not mourn. They calculated. A widow with 7 small children represented a liability. Feeding them through the winter required livestock that could otherwise be redistributed among the surviving warriors. The clan elder, a man named Targutai Kiriltug, made a cold decision that any nomadic accountant would have approved of. He ordered the camp broken. He ordered the herds taken. He ordered the family abandoned. Holun, Temujin's mother, ran after the departing column on foot. She grabbed the standard pole bearing the spirits of the ancestors. She begged. She screamed. The riders looked at her and kept moving. By nightfall, she stood alone on the steppe with 7 children, no horses, no sheep, no felt for a proper tent, and no allies within 100 miles. Secret History of the Mongols, the only insider account of these early years, describes what happened next with brutal directness. Holun tied her sash tight around her waist and began teaching her sons to eat things no respectable Mongol would ever consume. They dug for wild onions. They pulled roots from the riverbank. They speared fish from the Anan, which the steppe nobility considered a humiliation, since fish were the food of forest dwellers, not horse lords. They hunted marmots and field mice. They ate things that, in good times, would have marked them as unclean. This period rewired Temujin's brain in ways that European nobility could never replicate. A French knight raised in a stone keep absorbed assumptions about hierarchy, divine right, and the natural order of social classes. Temujin absorbed the opposite lesson. He learned that hierarchy was a fiction maintained by the strong against the weak. He learned that the men who had sworn oaths to his father had abandoned his mother in the snow. He learned that survival required treating every social rule as an obstacle to be navigated or destroyed. I find it staggering to consider that the largest empire in human history began as a survival reflex in the mind of a hungry child. Most warlords inherit armies. Temujin inherited a mother, 6 siblings, and a working knowledge of which roots were edible in February. The first killing came when he was around 13 years old. His half-brother Begter, the eldest son of Yesugei's second wife, had been hoarding food. He had taken a fish that Temujin and his full brother Kasar had caught. He had taken a bird that the younger boys had snared. In a starving household, this was not greed. It was a power play. Begter was positioning himself as the eventual head of the family, using control over food as leverage. Temujin and Kasar discussed the situation in a way that no 13-year-old should ever discuss anything. They did not plan a confrontation. They did not seek mediation from elders. They selected weapons. They approached Begter from 2 angles while he sat on a small hill watching the family's last surviving horses. They shot him with arrows. Holan's reaction, recorded in the secret history, is one of the most chilling passages in medieval literature. She did not grieve in the conventional sense. She raged. She compared her sons to wild animals that devour their own kin. She listed every betrayal the family had suffered and demanded to know why they were now adding fratricide to the catalog of horrors. But Temujin had already understood something his mother had not yet processed. A household with 2 competing centers of authority was a household that would fragment. Begter, growing older, would have eventually challenged him for leadership. The execution was not rage. It was institutional design. Temujin was, at 13, eliminating a structural rival the way a corporate executive eliminates a competing vice president. The Taechiad clan noticed. Targutai realized that the abandoned boy was growing into something dangerous. He organized a raiding party to capture Temujin before the child became a man with grievances and capabilities. They found him hiding in the forest. They locked an iron kang around his neck, a heavy wooden board with a hole for the throat, designed to prevent both escape and dignity. They paraded him from camp to camp as a slave. One night, during a feast at the Taechiad main camp, Temujin struck his guard with the edge of the kang and ran. He hid in the cold waters of the Anan River, his face barely above the surface, the wooden board floating around his neck. A man from a subordinate family named Sorkinshira spotted him. Sorkinshira had a choice. He could turn the boy in and earn favor from Targutai, or he could risk his own life to hide a fugitive whose only asset was a face that had survived too much. Sorkinshira chose to hide him. He cut the kang from Temujin's neck. He fed him. He sent him home. This act of mercy from a low-ranking herder, a man with no political power and no expectation of reward, taught Temujin the central lesson of his future career. Loyalty did not flow from blood. It did not flow from tradition. It flowed from debt, from shared danger, and from the recognition of competence between 2 desperate people. He would remember Sorkinshira. He would reward him decades later with a command that would have been unthinkable for a man of his birth. This was not sentimentality. It was the prototype of a system. By his late teens, Temujin had reassembled enough of his family's fortunes to marry Bert, the bride his father had arranged for him before the poisoning. The wedding gift she brought, a black sable coat of exceptional quality, became Temujin's first piece of political capital. He did not wear it. He did not display it. He took it directly to Togrul, the Khan of the Karate Confederation, the most powerful tribal leader in central Mongolia. Togrul had been Yesugei's blood brother decades earlier. Temujin invoked that old oath and presented the sable coat as a son's offering to a forgotten uncle. Togrul accepted. The teenager had just secured a protector who commanded tens of thousands of warriors. He had done it not through military strength, which he did not possess, but through a precise reading of the older man's vanity and his obligation to a dead friend. Months later, the Merkit tribe raided Temujin's small camp in retaliation for an old grievance involving Holun, who had originally been a Merkit bride before Yesuje kidnapped her. They took Bert. They distributed her among their warriors as a slave wife. She would be pregnant by one of them before Temujin recovered her. His response established the operational template that would define every campaign of his life. He did not raid the Merkits with his own small force. He did not seek revenge through individual heroism. He went to Togrul. He went to a childhood friend named Jamaka, who had become the leader of the rival Jadaran clan and who had sworn Anda, a blood brother oath, with Temujin when they were boys. He coordinated a three-pronged attack involving 20,000 riders. The Merkits were annihilated. Bert was recovered. Temujin accepted the child of her rape, a boy named Jachai, as his own son without public comment. The Mongol nobility would whisper about Jachai's origins for the rest of his life, and the question of his legitimacy would eventually fracture the empire after Genghis Khan's death. But in the immediate aftermath, Temujin had learned that coordinated multi-tribe operations could achieve outcomes that no single clan could match. He had also learned the political utility of public silence regarding personal humiliations. The friendship with Jamaka is the most psychologically complex relationship in Mongol history. The two had sworn the Anda bond 3 times during their childhood, exchanging knuckle bones, then arrows, then full ceremonies. Steppe tradition held the Anda bond as more sacred than blood kinship. Anda brothers were supposed to ride together, share wives, and die for each other. For nearly 2 years after the Merkit campaign, Temujin and Jamaka lived in a single combined camp, their followers intermingled, their herds grazing together. Then they separated, suddenly and without explanation. The secret history records a cryptic exchange in which Jamaka proposed that they camp in different locations. Border interpreted this as a hostile signal, though the surface words were ambiguous. The two Anda brothers parted ways. They began competing for followers. The split was philosophical. Jamaka represented the old aristocratic steppe order. He believed that command should flow through bloodlines, that noble families had inherent rights to leadership, and that low-born men should remain in their assigned roles. Temujin, the abandoned exile who had learned to eat marmots and who had been saved by a low-ranking herder, represented something entirely new. He began promoting men based purely on demonstrated competence. A shepherd who showed tactical insight could become a unit commander. A captured enemy who fought well could be incorporated into Temujin's personal guard. The traditional aristocrats found this offensive. Their followers found it fascinating. European feudalism of this same period operated on the opposite principle. A French peasant who demonstrated military genius would still be expected to defer to a noble-born commander whose primary qualification was the identity of his father. Temujin systematically reversed this. He weaponized the resentment of every low-born man on the steppe who had ever been overlooked. He offered them a contract that European serfs could only dream of: perform and rise, fail and die. I always find this organizational decision more revolutionary than any specific battle Temujin ever fought. He was constructing, in the late 12th century, a meritocratic command structure that European armies would not match until the Napoleonic reforms 600 years later. He did it not from ideological principle, but from necessity. As a man with no aristocratic legitimacy of his own, he could not afford to operate within an aristocratic system. He had to build a new one. The break with Jamaka turned violent around 1187 at a place called Dallin Baltshut, the 70 Marshes. Jamaka had assembled a coalition of 13 clans against Temujin. The battle itself was a catastrophic defeat. Temujin's forces broke and fled into the forests. His command structure scattered. For the next several years, he disappears almost entirely from the historical record. What Jamaka did to the prisoners after the battle, however, is documented in horrifying detail. He captured 70 chieftains who had supported Temujin and boiled them alive in 70 cauldrons. This was not standard steppe practice. Killing a defeated chieftain was acceptable, even expected. Mass execution by boiling was something else. It was theatrical. It was excessive. It was, in retrospect, a strategic error. The chronicler Rashid al-Din, writing more than a century later from Persian sources, identified the boiling of the 70 as the moment when steppe opinion began shifting away from Jamaica. The act was so culturally transgressive that even chieftains who disliked Temujin found themselves disturbed. Jamaica had violated the unwritten code that limited steppe violence. He had revealed himself as someone who would use cruelty for spectacle rather than for function. Temujin's disappearance during these years is one of the great mysteries of Mongol history. Some scholars argue he spent time as a slave or a low-status laborer in the Jin dynasty territories of northern China. Others suggest he hid among allied clans in the forests near Lake Baikal. The records simply stop. What is clear is that when he reappeared around the mid-1190s, he had transformed. The man who returned was not the same warlord who had fled Dallin Balt's hut. He had absorbed something. He had learned about administrative systems, about logistical networks, about how settled empires organized themselves. He returned with a vision that no previous steppe leader had ever possessed. He intended not just to unite the tribes. He intended to weaponize them against the entire civilizational order of Eurasia. The Tatar extermination of 1202 announced the new Temujin to the world. The Tatars, the same confederation that had poisoned his father 3 decades earlier, had become temporarily allied with Temujin and Togrul in a campaign against another rival. After the campaign succeeded, Temujin executed a decision that horrified even his own followers. He ordered that every Tatar male taller than the linchpin of a cartwheel be killed. The linchpin sat roughly 3 feet from the ground. This meant every Tatar boy older than approximately 5 years of age. The women and the youngest children would be absorbed into Mongol households. The males would be eliminated as a demographic category. This was not the impulsive rage of a man avenging his father. This was industrial-scale demographic engineering. Temujin had calculated that as long as Tatar males existed who remembered their tribal identity, the blood feud would continue across generations. By eliminating the entire male population above a specific height, he was not punishing the Tatars. He was deleting them. The tribe would cease to exist as a coherent group. The women, distributed across Mongol households, would raise their next children as Mongols. The chronicler Ada Malik Juveni, writing in the 13th century from sources sympathetic to the Mongols, describes the operation with a kind of horrified admiration. He notes that the executions were carried out systematically over several days, by units that had been specifically assigned the task, with quotas and verification procedures. The Tatars, who had once been one of the most powerful confederations on the eastern steppe, vanished from history within a single week. European armies of this same period could not have conceived of an operation at this scale, not because they were morally superior, but because they lacked the organizational capacity. A European baron commanding a campaign of demographic extermination would have found his troops fragmenting within hours. Soldiers would have refused. Priests would have intervened. The logistical demands of identifying, separating, and executing thousands of specific individuals, according to a measurable criterion, would have exceeded the administrative capabilities of any medieval European state. The Mongols, organized in their decimal units of tens and hundreds and thousands, with commanders selected purely on competence, executed the operation as a coordinated logistical exercise. This is the moment when modern observers should recognize what Temujin had actually built. He had constructed not just an army but an administrative machine capable of executing complex multi-step operations across vast distances with precise accountability. The fact that the first major demonstration of this machine was a genocide does not diminish the organizational achievement. It defines it. Togrul, the Karait Khan who had been Temujin's protector for 2 decades, watched the Tatar extermination with growing alarm. His own son Sengam hated Temujin and had been whispering for years that the upstart was becoming too dangerous. Jamaka, who had been displaced as Togrul's preferred ally, added his own venom to the conversation. The aging Togrul began to listen. Sengam and Jamaka designed an elaborate trap. They convinced Togrul to invite Temujin to a betrothal feast, ostensibly to celebrate the engagement of Temujin's son Jachai to one of Togrul's granddaughters. The trap was simple. Once Temujin arrived with a small escort, expecting a family ceremony, the Karait warriors would surround the tent and eliminate him. The plan failed because of a low-ranking herder named Badai, who overheard 2 of the conspirators discussing the ambush while he was tending horses. Badai understood immediately what he had heard. He also understood that if Temujin died, the meritocratic system that had elevated men like himself would die with him. He rode through the night to warn Temujin. This was the practical payoff of the meritocratic structure. A herder in any other army of the medieval world would have had no incentive to risk his life for the survival of his commander. The European peasant who served a duke gained nothing if the duke survived an assassination attempt. The Mongol herder who served Temujin gained everything, because the entire system of advancement depended on Temujin remaining alive to maintain it. Temujin escaped the trap by riding north with a small force. The subsequent campaign against the Karait was brutal and brief. At the Battle of the Jejer Heights, Temujin's forces shattered Togrul's army through a combination of tactical surprise and superior unit cohesion. Togrul himself fled and was killed by Nayman border guards who did not recognize the deposed Khan. Sengam disappeared into the western deserts and was never heard from again. Badai, the herder who had warned Temujin, was elevated to the rank of 1,000 commander, with control over a unit larger than most European baronies. The final obstacle was the Nayman Confederation under Tayang Khan, the wealthiest and most settled of the steppe tribes. The Nayman had inherited administrative practices from earlier Turkic empires. They used Uyghur scribes. They issued written documents. They imagined themselves as the legitimate inheritors of steppe political tradition. Tayang Khan looked at Temujin's rise with the disdain of an established aristocrat watching a successful peasant. Temujin's campaign against the Nayman in 1204 demonstrated the full evolution of his military thinking. He approached their territory with a numerically inferior force. Rather than risk a direct engagement, he ordered every soldier to light 5 separate campfires each night. The Nayman scouts, observing the enemy camp from the surrounding hills, calculated army size based on fire counts. They reported back to Tayang Khan that Temujin's army was 5 times larger than its actual size. Tayang Khan hesitated. His son urged immediate attack. His advisors urged retreat to a more defensible position. The Nayman command structure, organized along traditional aristocratic lines, descended into argument. Days passed while they debated. Temujin used the time to position his actual forces precisely where he wanted them. The Battle of Chakarmount shattered the Nayman. Tayang Khan was wounded and died on the field. His commanders, who had spent days arguing rather than acting, found themselves outmaneuvered by units that received orders and executed them within minutes. The Nayman scribes, who had imagined themselves as the cultural superiors of the rough Mongols, were captured along with their seals and their written records. Temujin took the seals into his own service. Within months, the Mongols had a writing system, a chancellery, and the beginnings of a documented administrative state. Jamaka, the Anda brother who had become the central rival, fled the battlefield with a handful of followers. Over the following months, his own men betrayed him. They brought him bound to Temujin's camp, expecting reward. Temujin had them executed for treachery against their commander, even though that commander was his enemy. This was the meritocratic system's logic taken to its absolute conclusion. Loyalty mattered more than alignment. A man who betrayed his own leader could never be trusted by a new one. The conversation between Temujin and Jamukha before the latter's execution is one of the most remarkable passages in the secret history. There is no triumph. There is no gloating. Jamukha asks for a death without spilling blood, the step execution reserved for nobility, in which the victim is wrapped in carpets and suffocated. Temujin grants the request. The two Anda brothers part for the last time with something resembling mutual respect. Jamukha acknowledges that Temujin's vision had been larger than his own. Temujin acknowledges that Jamukha had been the rival who shaped him. In the spring of 1206, at the headwaters of the Anan River, the assembled chieftains of every Mongol tribe gathered for a Kurultai, a great council. They proclaimed Temujin as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler, the Oceanic Khan. He was 44 years old. He had spent 35 years climbing out of the frozen ditch where his story began. What he did next is the most baffling decision in the entire narrative, and it is the moment that separates Genghis Khan from every other unifier in human history. A normal warlord, having finally consolidated control over his ancestral territory, would have done what successful warlords always do. He would have built palaces. He would have rewarded his commanders with land grants. He would have settled into 2 decades of ceremonial rule, hunting, drinking, and producing heirs. Genghis Khan did the opposite. Within months of the Kurultai, he began organizing the unified Mongol forces for an invasion of the Tangut Zaizia, the Buddhist kingdom on his southern border. Within 3 years, he was probing the defenses of the Jin dynasty, the great Jurchen empire that controlled northern China. The unification of Mongolia, which had taken him 3.5 decades, had not been the goal. It had been infrastructure. This is the moment historians most consistently underestimate. Temujin did not unify the tribes in order to rule them. He unified them in order to weaponize them outward. The meritocratic command structure, the decimal military organization, the elimination of aristocratic privilege, the genocide of rival tribes, the absorption of administrative knowledge from settled peoples, all of it had been preparation for something larger. He had spent his entire adult life building a machine. Now he was about to turn it on. The anticlimax of the 1206 Kurultai is that there was no rest. There was no consolidation period. There was no enjoyment of accumulated power. There was only acceleration. The man who had eaten field mice in a ditch at age 9 now commanded the most efficient military organization on the planet, and he had no intention of letting it sit idle. Genghis Khan died in August of 1227, during the final campaign against the Tangut. The exact circumstances of his death remain disputed. The most common account holds that he fell from a horse during a hunt several months earlier and never fully recovered. Other sources suggest illness, infection, or wounds received in battle. His commanders concealed the death until the Tangut campaign was completed and the Zaizia capital had been destroyed. The location of his grave was deliberately hidden. The escort that delivered his body to the burial site was executed. The slaves who dug the grave were executed. The soldiers who executed the slaves were executed. To this day, no one knows where Genghis Khan is buried. At the time of his death, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Within 50 years of his death, his grandchildren would push it from the South China Sea to the gates of Vienna. It would become the largest contiguous land empire in human history, a territorial achievement that has never been matched. More than 5% of the world's current male population carries genetic markers traceable to Genghis Khan and his immediate male relatives. He may be the most reproductively successful human being who ever lived. The military and organizational principles he developed continue to shape modern warfare in ways most contemporary observers fail to recognize. The Soviet military reformers of the 1930s, particularly Marshal Tukhachevsky, studied the Mongol campaigns explicitly and incorporated their principles into the doctrine of deep operations. The Israeli Defense Forces, facing the problem of how to fight outnumbered against multiple opponents, developed a mission command philosophy that emphasizes small unit autonomy and rapid decision-making at the lowest possible level. This is the Genghis Khan system, updated for radios and tanks. The American Special Forces concept of small teams operating independently behind enemy lines, with broad strategic guidance but tactical freedom, descends directly from the Mongol Arban structure. The corporate restructurings that swept through American business in the 1980s and 1990s, with their emphasis on flatter hierarchies, merit-based promotion, and the elimination of inherited positions, echo principles that Temujin pioneered 8 centuries earlier. Whenever a modern organization replaces a credentialed underperformer with a competent outsider, it is operating on the philosophical foundation that the abandoned boy on the Annan River established when he promoted a shepherd over a chieftain's son. Think about the conventional list of names that history teaches us to revere. Alexander, who inherited a kingdom from his father. Caesar, who came from one of the oldest noble families in Rome. Napoleon, who was at least born into the minor aristocracy of Corsica. We celebrate these figures and place them in textbooks and name cities after them. They were all undeniably brilliant. They were all also the products of systems that had prepared them for greatness from birth. Genghis Khan was prepared for nothing. He was prepared to die in a ditch. He was prepared to be enslaved. He was prepared to watch his family starve. The system into which he was born had explicitly designated him for elimination, and it had taken active measures to ensure that elimination. He survived because his mother taught him to eat marmots. He thrived because he recognized that every social rule arrayed against him was a lie. We celebrate kings born into thrones. We build monuments to generals who inherited their armies. We write biographies of conquerors whose paths were paved by the families they were lucky enough to be born into. But what does it say about our civilization, and about the stories we choose to tell, that the man who built the largest empire in human history began by eating field mice in a frozen ditch, and we struggle to remember his actual name? Thank you for exploring this incredible journey with me. If you found this deep dive into the origins of the Mongol Empire valuable, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. Let me know in the comments who you think is the most underrated origin story in history, the leader whose beginnings deserve more attention than they receive. Stay curious, and I will see you in the next video.